Good morning, everyone. I do these in the morning when I guess I feel fresher. Can think better. By the afternoon, I'm generally a little wiped out. Busy mornings. Um, so this is the recording on Ted Aoki's chapter article on situational praxis. Um, and Clearly, he is not referring to the test, since many of you are first introduced to the term praxis by the tests. And Aoki would argue, as would I, that those tests are furthest from the concept of praxis, which I'll go into a little bit in a second. Ted Aoki has been a curricular scholar of some importance. He is a Japanese Canadian, or was. He passed away probably about 10 years ago. It's all very foggy. I never met him, although I'm pretty confident we were in the same building in Peabody Hall at LSU the summer of '89. I had just left my job and was inquiring into the different education programs over several weeks in July. And it just so happened, as I learned earlier, that he was a visiting professor teaching at LSU that summer. So I don't think I ran into him. I don't remember that. Maybe through osmosis, his presence may have influenced me a little bit. But I've enjoyed his work. I've presented on his work. I presented, in fact, I presented on the glosses that you folks do in this class. And my attempts to have you apply that in the curriculum project, the compacting and unpacking, the unpacking and repacking project. And it just so happened his son, who's not an educator per se, was there at the conference I presented and sat in. So he was very appreciative of what I was trying to do. At least that's what he told me. So that made me feel pretty good. Anyway, so let's kind of get started. I'll add before, as I try to share the screen here, that he also, being a Japanese Canadian, like Japanese Americans at the time of the Second World War, was also put into an internment camp because he lived in Western Canada. He lived in British Columbia, in Vancouver. So that was his, experience as well. Probably most definitely colored his understanding of authority, the way he saw authority. And I think it comes through in his work as well. So the term praxis is actually from the ancient Greeks. As I say up here, it's not the test, but it is thoughtful, critical, reflective, higher ordered thinking, practice. So it's not instrumental practice. It's not responding to a given situation without thought. Okay. Um, and it's not the a reflex action in that sense. It is a reflective action. So and Aoki goes into praxis a little bit, and he talks about theoria, and I argue that because of the nature of education, because of the nature of schooling and teaching, all theory is a consequence of practice. Hopefully, all theory is a consequence of praxis. So, to keep it simple, if when we talk about, when we write about, when we discuss teaching practice, we are engaged in theory because we're thinking about what we're doing. Thus, we're engaged in praxis, teaching praxis. Okay. So when you stop and think about the curriculum and how it impacts you and your students, which is what this class is meant for, then you are engaging in praxis. Okay. So implementation. An instrumental action. Okay. Is something that, since I've been at Nichols, is something that we have to engage in, and as I shouldn't say we, you as teachers engage in more and more. There's very little room by design for you to be thoughtful. And there are a number of things that work theoretically and politically towards that end. Unfortunately, we don't have time in the summer to read chapter 4, which gets into a more critical stance in terms of thinking about an ideological aspect to curriculum. Aoki's talking about it to some degree in chapter 2, but not in any specifics. Okay. So we have been under either Common Core or the Louisiana Academic Standards, which is basically Common Core, dressed up as a local, meaning statewide curriculum, for some time now. And I wish I could remember. So at least 5, 6 years. But the standards are not a curriculum. And I know many of you are going to say that when you think of curriculum, you think of the standards. Well, even the Louisiana Believes website makes the statement that the standards are not the curriculum, that they provide a structure for the curriculum. The standards, however, do suggest a new curricular approach. And it's a development, the kind of development that epitomizes, its development epitomizes, I should have deleted something. I'm going to delete this while we're up here. Epitomizes the R&D approach. Okay. that Aoki talks about. So in your glosses, I don't know that you need to dwell on the R&D approach too much. I would rather you dwell in the situational approach, and to really try to talk about that. Certainly, you can bring in the R&D approach and your experience in that to juxtapose the situational. Um, so, in I would suggest that the R&D approach is something that develops as we as the curriculum becomes more and more top down. And I would point to the establishment of the Department of Education as a separate cabinet position under Jimmy Carter as the beginning of this process, more so even than Sputnik, because the often our current notions of curriculum move are argued to begin with Sputnik in the late 50s, and I don't know that development, while it provided resources, was trying to tell the teacher what to teach. It was urging teachers to take to to engage in more of what we call STEM today, or STEAL, I guess, maybe the other term, I can't remember. So anyway, but I would argue that this little statement, Louisiana academic standards plus compass assessment, or whatever assessment your district is using, because I think some are not using compass and they're using the NIET assessment, along with the end of course testing, that equals, in a broad sense, a curriculum as plan that leads to an instrumental approach. And all this is tied to money, okay? Either your money or the district's money. And that's how they seek to control, and whoever they is. Really, we ultimately blame the legislature because they implement things that Bessie wants. And Bessie are not independent thinkers. They're controlled as well, particularly this current Bessie board. They're controlled by national forces, I believe. Of course, John White was also controlled. So he's not my favorite. I wouldn't also point to the reform when the state decided, which I supported at the time, not being fully aware, when we got rid of the elected Secretary of Education to an appointed head of education. And that really changed the politics. And so it's interesting because the Secretary of Ed, the person running education, is no longer responsive to the people. They're responsive to Bessie. Even one could argue a few years ago it was the governor as well, but clearly our governor, John Bell Edwards, didn't have the political acuity to appoint his own head of education, so or get rid of John White through most of his first term. So This is this I think is an issue. Too much power now in the hands of Bessie, I think. So here's a statement out of the curriculum page of Louisiana Believes. The department, meaning the Louisiana Department of Education, assists local school systems in selecting high quality curriculum and aligning curriculum with assessments and professional development. Okay. In other words, district and school curriculum are filtered at the state level. And I think filtered is a friendly term here. I would say directed at the state level would be another way to think about it, which further removes the teacher from the decision-making process. Okay. We don't want to trust our teachers to make these decisions, it seems. This is a classic R&D approach. Okay. Aoki's question, I think, for us today is, how can a teacher be evaluated for implementing a curriculum that they had no or little role in creating? So what's the point of evaluating? Your ability to implement something that limits your ability to teach the content? It's a self-defeating process, I'm afraid. And understand, politically, I'm not a radical person here, but I do see this as highly problematic. Beginning with my first class in education, I argued against this coming out of 4 years in business, because we would never run our businesses this way if we could help it. Okay. That's not my experience at the time in running business. Okay. So now let's talk about Aoki's situational praxis. A couple of things is something we should recognize, that all educational practices imply a theoretical or a political stance. Now, by political, I'm not referring to Republican or Democrat. What I'm really talking about is an ideological stance. Okay. And this is, I can't remember if it's a quote or paraphrase in Aoki from Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator, and sort of interestingly combined liberation theology with a little bit of Marxism to argue for argue against what he would have called the banking form of education, which is what we're engaged in today, meaning it's a top-down, and it takes the approach that education is an act of scarcity, and you'll read more about that, or you will have begun reading about that in the Curriculum in Abundance to get a better sense of that. And Freire's arguing that, and he's coming out of a Brazilian experience, okay, that we need more local control, particularly in terms of the peasants in Brazil that he was working with. Okay. Praxis, and one way to understand praxis is as right action. Okay. So to do right action, we have to think about what is right and wrong. And there is a right and wrong. What truths are we coming out of? I'm now displaying a little bit of my um, conservative stance. Okay. Um, and this begins as a theological stance. It's a theoretical stance, but it begins as a theological stance. And it's something that draws from, in particular, the Puritans. And those who are in 504 will be reading the Technologia article that my friend Doug McKnight and I wrote. And you'll, you'll, you'll see where we're coming from in this. And it's also, but it also comes in, and Aoki talks about his reading of John Paul II and his philosophy of praxis, a book I've read and looked at. And John Paul II really is asking a larger question about how we act in the world as Catholics and Christians. And he questions, how does one person engage another person? How do we engage, if we will, the stranger, that new person that comes along? So we're not necessarily talking about people that are part of our community, but people that enter into our lives from outside. And the role of the teacher, I mean, you're meeting your students for the first time. Generally, they are the stranger. They're the other. They're people coming in from outside the community or your immediate community. In your role, one of your roles is to try to build community within that classroom. I'm not sure how successful we can be. Not that some don't have more success than others, because I don't know that a classroom or a school in our day and age, and where our students come from, where we live, as in relation to our students, can ever really become a community. I think when I was a child, grammar school, elementary school student, um, we the school was more of a community. Our teachers lived in the same community that our students lived in. All right. So there was a relationship beyond the school that was true community. Um, and, too many, I would argue that a lot of, we find that people talk about community, but they really aren't engaged in community. They're really engaged in kinds of associations where people come together around some common interest, and then they leave. Okay. I think a great example of that is people that go to Saints games. Okay. The very different people all coming together for one common interest, and for a given moment, they act as if they are a community, but really what they are an association of fans, because they go back to their separate their separate neighborhoods. Um, so political parties are the same way. So the question is, do we, and this comes out of both John Paul II, but it also comes out of Wittgenstein, who I've referred to before, in his philosophy. Do we approach the other as an automaton, a robot, or do we approach the other as if they're an embodied soul? Okay. So, or as if they had a soul. And, my open question is, how do you treat the cashier at the grocery? Okay. Are you indifferent, or do you try to be friendly? despite whatever kind of day that cashier is having. So I think to try to be friendly, to be pleasant, to wish them well, is approaching them as if they're a soul. To be indifferent, just pay the money and move on. Be irritated if they're not doing something perfectly. Treats them as if they're an automaton. So how we treat the cashier, I think, is an important point about how we even treat our coworkers and students. So do we see human beings as mundane objects? Or are we viewing them with awe? Okay? Or do we view them with awe, with wonder, by their differing subjectivities? Okay? And this idea of subjectivity is important, particularly to John Paul II. Okay. So it kind of asks a question in the situation, in practice, and the way to think about this is, do we live bisubjectively? Meaning, do we try to live through the other while still living through ourselves? And it's a little more complicated. So, and this is I would argue this, and it's been argued, that this is an ideal that we should be striving for in our spousal relationships. After 41 years, 42 in September years of marriage, I think I'm finally succeeding in some small way of living subjectively. Some of that maybe got called into question while we were quarantined in house together, both working from home. But we worked through it, and you know, things are much better. So we all have, but one of the things I'm taught is, through the reading of John Paul II's Theology of the Body, this is kind of where this comes from as well, is how we live with our spouse will go a long way to how we live with others in a celibate way. Okay. This also requires empathy, and I'm drawing upon the work of Edith Stein, also known as St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross. In her work, I also am drawing upon her for these ideas of community and association. Some of you may have heard of her, particularly as St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross. She's an important philosopher. She influenced John Paul II before she converted to Catholicism and became a nun. And unfortunately, because of her Jewish heritage, was killed at Auschwitz, deported by the Nazis. Okay, we'll finish up here. Aoki talks about 3 assumptions to situational praxis. Number 1, to be human and to treat the other as human is the basic vocation of all human beings. And I would definitely agree with that. Our fundamental calling, if you will. This is something the Puritans talked about, surprisingly. And it's also very much tied to our religious beliefs. It is to see all human beings not as objects or technocratic entities, which we do so too much in our world today, but as persons with their own subjectivities, their own personalities, their own wishes, desires, and interests. An interest here is great. Number 2, people, teachers and students, we have to recognize are capable of transforming their own realities Humans are beings who act upon the world and upon each other. We can act well or we can act badly, but both acts have the potential to be transformational. Of course, the whole point of education is to be transformational. So education is a fundamental action in who we're becoming. The use of formative assessment is to create data for the construction of ongoing educational realities. Notice I don't say summative. It's the formative assessments that can be formal or informal. Create data for the construction of our ongoing educational realities, our classroom environments. Okay. This is how we understand what the situation is to engage in praxis. Okay. And remember always, and this comes from Dewey, the primary role of the teacher is to create the learning environments within their classrooms. That's important. Okay. And create learning environments where the most students possible can succeed. It's never to suggest that all students will succeed. Okay. Also, and this is repetitious a little bit, education is never neutral. Okay. This is, in a sense, a political stance, and where I come out with this, and I've talked about this in the Dahl piece, again, quoting Whitehead, where attainable knowledge could have changed the issue, ignorance has the guilt of vice. Okay, if we leave our students ignorant, okay, then in terms of the knowledge we're trying and skills we're trying to teach them that will alter their lives in a positive way, then that ignorance has the guilt of vice. So education holds within itself the potential to change social relationships. So how one acts towards the other. Okay. If you have any questions, as always, about the presentation video, then please email me. All right. So you take care. I will be doing. These are all the. I'm sorry. This is the last of the videos dealing with the readings. The videos. Okay. I still have a couple other videos to do, but they'll be next week. Take care.